Welcome to this video on ownership and heritage. This is a big issue. Ownership and definition of heritage are linked together. We have noted in the previous video, it's generally nations that define heritage, often guided by UNESCO. Our colleague, Dr. Amy Strecker, says intangible heritage is different and more complex in terms of ownership, especially when we are talking about things that seemingly should not be owned, such as natural resources and traditional knowledge. Unfortunately, the system of patent and trademarks can issue ownership of even intangible heritage. This often excludes the source people that own the heritage, and we see this in the cases of, for example, ethnomedicine and indigenous knowledge. Contestation of ownership and lack of access lead to attacks and destruction of heritage. When a living heritage is attacked or destroyed, destruction can be seen as an attack on the people who identify with the attacked heritage, as we will see in the Bamiyan Buddhas and also the Timbuktu tombs. Also, contrary to ownership, disownership threatens heritage. Historically, often indigenous cultures have been forced to disconnect from heritage due to Christian and Muslim missionaries, as well as potential internal pressures due to the nation-building politics. Also, conflicts arise from such coercion and other top-down approaches. Sometimes heritage can be also misappropriated. In trying to promote tourism to boost the economy, governments might take over local heritage and nationalize it. For example, tourism is a way that heritage that might potentially have sacred meaning to a group of people is taken over by governments and misappropriated. The issue of ownership is related also to the issue of heritage governance. UNESCO member states, through their national committees, provide inventory lists, including potential World Heritage Sites, and write nominations for the status of World Heritage. Heritage governance is guided by national and international laws and policies. International laws can include the Human Rights Declaration, the Hague Convention, the World Heritage Convention, and the Bora Charter, just to mention a few. Ultimately, however, it's agreed that domestic laws are the most important for the protection of heritage, even World Heritage Sites. Hence, the national heritage is at the mercy of the nation-state. And also the issue of access is also ultimately a national issue. As Kusia, one of our experts, said, UNESCO is as good as its member states want it to be. UNESCO cannot put sanctions or physically intervene. However, UNESCO is actually not unfamiliar with interventions. It recognized Palestine, and USA withdrew its funding as a reaction to UNESCO's recognition of Palestine. However, from cultural point of view, Palestine can now submit its inventory list from its territory. They successfully already put 2 sites on the list, as you can see on the image here, the landscape of southern Jerusalem being one of them. So the issue of sovereignty is relevant here. Similarly, new nations like Kosovo and South Sudan will also represent their heritage. There are also unrepresented nations that have an observer status within the UN, as you can see on the map. So, who represents their heritage? In regards to nation-states having a responsibility for heritage, Professor Dick Dowse, one of our experts, who specializes in history of the Middle East, asks, how do we disconnect the relationship between the nation-state and heritage in an increasingly post-nation-state world? And what about the heritage of failed states? We will hear more from Professor Dick Dowse later, but this reminds me of Somalia and Somaliland. Somalia is often written about as a failed state, and Somaliland, although officially not recognized, is reported as a success, being a de facto country with its ties with the international community, with an elected government and constitution. However, as it is not internationally recognized and not a member state of the UN, it cannot submit sites for UNESCO. UNESCO's position as an organization of nation-states is not convenient or helpful to groups whose heritage is not represented by the national heritage. They are in the end at the mercy of the nation-state on whose territory they reside. Beyond listing the sites and governing heritage internationally, we also have collections. So who owns those collections? Particularly in the former colonial world, where collections are not in their original source country. We will also look at the laws that affect colonial collections in a later module. However, we see that ownership and access in heritage are contested. We have to ask, how do local ownership and universal ownership contradict each other, for example, when we see collections held outside the countries of origin, such as the famous Parthenon marbles? We will later discuss this issue on museums and ownership. Now we are going to hear from our experts on specific examples of this week's modules. See you next time.